it really moves me to see that there are people interested in solving this conflict. I say this because it isn't receiving much attention around the world. I think the Scandinavian countries are particularly active, and I think you should be commended for this interest. People sometimes ask me what got me interested in this issue. Well, I had some passing knowledge of it from years spent at the U.S. Embassy in Algeria, but I never got very deeply into what the solution should be. I was much more interested in the welfare of the refugees in the refugee camps, where there is, as you know, a humanitarian crisis at this point. And so when I was asked to become personal envoy, and people kept saying, why do you want to take this job that's going to never lead to a solution? I said to myself, well, even if there's only the slightest hope that I can contribute to a solution that gets the refugees back to their homes in an honorable way, and I stress an honorable way, then I'm willing to proceed. And so I took the job and spent 8 years in it, actually. But, as you know, this conflict has really perpetuated 50 years of a real tragedy. There are about 160,000 refugees from the Moroccan control living in very difficult conditions in the Algerian desert. And there are a like number that live in often precarious situations under Moroccan administration. So these are the people I want to help. Now, I've been asked to share some thoughts about how the UN can help to facilitate a real process for Western Sahara. The short answer is that perhaps the UN cannot. Various components of the UN system have been working to help find a solution since the mid-1980s without success. And to find ways that the UN could help in the future, it might be instructive to look at why it's failed in the past. UN involvement has used 3 different approaches in the search for a settlement. The first approach, which ran from the mid-80s to 2004, consisted of a joint UN-African effort to design a settlement and seek the agreement of Morocco and the Polisario. The draft settlement plan that resulted in 1991, as you know, called for a ceasefire in exchange for a referendum. This approach crashed when even James Baker, who guided the last 7 years of this approach, could not get the parties to agree to the plan, even with amendments designed to please them. Baker resigned when it became clear that the Security Council would not put any pressure on the parties. And the final nail in the coffin of this approach came when the new king, Mohammed VI, informed the Secretary General that a referendum was out of the question because it conflicted with Moroccan sovereignty. No one challenged this claim, and this will prove to be a leitmotif throughout the process. Now, once that approach ended, There was a period of a couple of years from 2005 to 2007 when the political efforts to find a solution were put on pause while the various stakeholders tried to decide what to do. But MINURSO remained active under the command of our friend Kurt Mosgaard. The second approach to the search for a settlement, which ran from 2007 to 2012 and again from 2018 to 2019, consisted of face-to-face talks between Morocco and the Polisario on the basis of the proposals that they put forward in April 2007. And you know their terms: Morocco for autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty, the Polisario for a referendum of self-determination with independence and privileged relations with Morocco as an option. Now, three successive personal envoys, the Dutch diplomat Peter van Walsum, myself, and the former president of Germany, Horst Kohler, held a total of 15 rounds of such talks between Morocco and the Polisario, with Algeria and Mauritania present as neighboring states. The Security Council requested in each of its resolutions, and continues to do so at this day, that the Secretary General facilitate such negotiations to arrive at, quote, this is very important, a mutually acceptable political solution which will provide for the self-determination of the people of Western Sahara, unquote. This was our mandate. Despite our best efforts, no negotiations occurred in 15 rounds of talks, none. They never went anywhere. You may ask why. The Polisario came to each session ready to discuss both proposals. But Morocco came with a major precondition, that it would discuss only its own proposal. Needless to say, the Polisario refused to accept what it saw as a diktat, and the negotiations were stillborn from the beginning. So we had this first approach of the UN and the African organizations trying to design an agreement. We had a second approach of direct negotiations face-to-face between the parties. But after 15 rounds, there had been absolutely no movement for the reasons I've said. The Polisario was prepared to discuss both proposals. Morocco insisted that only its proposal was to be discussed, and talks basically entered stalemate right there. Now, because of that, I pushed the discussions into various issues outside these two proposals. These included confidence-building measures, natural resources, and human rights. Again, as the parties engaged on these issues, or on some of them, they refused to engage in a constructive way. They each preferred to camp on their own proposals. So we had a discussion of natural resources in Geneva. The Moroccans came with an enormous delegation, which was there to tell us all about all the efforts were being made with regard to natural resources in Western Sahara. And the Polisario came with a delegation of two. One was our dear departed friend, Mohammed Khaddad, and the other was a very skillful lawyer representing the Polisario in Australia, whose only intervention was to say, that everything that Morocco was doing in the territory of Western Sahara was illegitimate. So again, there was no possibility of discussing anything. But it became clear to me that this face-to-face approach was not going to go anywhere. Then I tried a third approach. And the third approach was to engage each party and each stakeholder bilaterally, talking to each one of them separately, in the hopes that when the parties were talking to me directly, without the audience of the face-to-face talks, etc., that they might be show a little bit more flexibility. That was with regard to the parties, and with regard to the stakeholders, especially the members of the group of friends. My hope was that they would, in talking to me, be a bit more flexible about, or a bit more willing to consider pressure on the parties. But again, this third approach led to nothing. The parties remained fixed to their positions, and this group of friends and the stakeholders remained unwilling to engage. So my successor, Horst Köhler, came back to the approach of face-to-face talks and held 2 meetings in Geneva in 2018 and 19. Oddly enough, the Security Council hailed the resumption of these talks as a sign of progress, but it didn't go on to mention that none of the parties changed their position, and that the big brouhaha there had been about the fact that the table was round instead of rectangular, and that somehow this, in Moroccan eyes, made the Algerians a party. Of course, Algeria maintained its traditional position that it was there as a neighboring state and not as a party. But the Security Council, in its inaction, was so desperate to find any sign of a solution or of progress towards a solution, that even this tiny fact of holding 2 meetings without any real progress was made to be a big deal. Anyway, we now have a 4th personal envoy. 1, 2, I forgot, is it 4 or 5? In any case, the new envoy, Stefan de Mistura, who was appointed in late 2021, has been going around consulting the various parties and the international stakeholders to see how best he might be able to proceed. So we know what's been tried, we know what's been failed what's failed under current circumstances. What are the reasons for this failure? And here we get into some nitty-gritty. First, unlike the Polisario, which wants to negotiate a way to find out what the people of Western Sahara want, Morocco does not want to negotiate and engages in the process solely to fend off criticism. I often likened it to a charade, because their Moroccan engagement was not genuine, was not in good faith. Morocco is comfortable with the status quo. It's working actively to develop its Sahara and to widen international acceptance of its presence in that territory. Its insistence that only its proposal should be discussed has effectively cut off dialogue. It's repeatedly exploited what it declares to be anti-Moroccan acts or words by this party or another as an excuse to delay the resumption of the search for a settlement, often for months. I could give you many examples, including one in which we agreed, because the Moroccans were unhappy, to share the drafts of our reports to the Security Council as the price for resuming the negotiating process after a hiatus of many, many months. Fortunately, the agreement of the previous Secretary General to that arrangement was annulled with the new Secretary General. So the first reason is that Morocco really does not want to negotiate. It plays at negotiation. The second reason is that both the parties and the neighboring states are really locked into their positions, and they have no incentive really to move. They have enough support at home, and they have enough support from outside to maintain their positions indefinitely. Morocco has France, the US, Spain on its side to varying degrees, and we've seen all the ins and outs and shifts of positions there. But in general, these countries have been sympathetic to Morocco. Polisario has Algeria, Russia, the UK, South Africa, and others on its side, again to varying degrees and at various times. But what this boils down to is a situation of what I call stasis. There is no pressure to make any party shift its position. So absent some kind of a major domestic event in one of the parties, be it the death of a leader, a coup d'etat, or the accidental or intentional escalation of skirmishes into full-blown hostilities, or the intervention of major outside stakeholders, nothing is going to change. And this could go on for decades and decades, if none of these elements that I've mentioned take place. So that's a second reason. First reason was Morocco doesn't want to negotiate. The second reason is that both parties and the neighboring states are locked into their positions. Third reason is, and this is really in many ways the most important, it is that the major international stakeholders, including the group of friends, remain divided. They want to avoid yet another entanglement on a very crowded global agenda, and they don't want to choose sides between Morocco and Algeria. It's instructive in this regard that France, which has traditionally had the closest relations to Morocco, did not follow former President Trump's lead when he recognized the so-called sovereignty of Morocco on the territory. It knew better. And the Biden administration, while it hasn't repudiated Trump's proclamation for fear that it might disturb the Abraham Accords, which of course have now found other reasons to be disturbed, the Biden administration has not included that proclamation in any of its rhetoric or opened a consulate as was foreseen in Western Sahara. It prefers to express support for the UN process and for the personal envoy. So those are three reasons why things have not moved. And now we should ask ourselves, despite all this gloom, what can be done to promote a settlement? Well, first of all, successive personal envoys since James Baker have up to now acted solely as meeting facilitators. The personal envoy's mandate cannot be just that. It should be broadened to include the personal envoy's freedom to float ideas and proposals of his own, or perhaps one day her own. I put this very directly to the Secretary General after I left the job, but I don't see that anything has happened to implement such a change, and it would be difficult because if my own experience is any guide, Morocco would fiercely oppose having the facilitator become a mediator. Morocco doesn't want any new ideas. It wants recognition of its solution. The second thing that needs to be done, perhaps, is that civil society groups like yourselves need to intensify their activities on the international scene, linking up with like-minded groups in other countries, not least being the US, which has very few organizations that take real interest in Western Sahara, despite the fact that the US is the pen holder for Security Council resolutions. And the theme there should be the assent of the people to their governance is essential for stability and security. We don't know what the two halves of the people of Western Sahara want, so some form of self-determination is needed. The last point is not as important. We will skip over it. And that gives you a few ideas as to why things didn't work and what few things might be able to be done in the future.
Thank you so much.